Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
I'm so excited to have you. And, as we were talking before I began the recording, I don't know how I found you. I'm pretty sure it's Instagram. And I was like, highly sensitive healing. Don't mind if I do. So and to read that you're an HSP, love, and then INFJ, love. I'm like, we have to stick together, us people,
Are you an INFJ too?
Yes.
Oh, of course you are. I'm so in love with everything you put out there. That makes so much sense.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's funny because, we're the most rare, right?
Mhm.
But I joke with my partner because he's always like, oh my God, you met another INFJ today. They're everywhere. How are they the rarest? And I'm like, I don't know. They just somehow are in my orbit, right?
That's funny. Yeah, I think it works that way once we awaken to the fact that we are and how that's different. At least that's what it was for me. And I tell clients and people all the time, because not everyone I work with is an INFJ, but they're pretty far on the sensitivity scale. A lot of them are. And I heard a really fascinating statistic not too long ago that INFJs make up the smallest percentage of the physical population, but the largest percentage of the online population.
Oh,
Because we're all introverts, right? It's so much easier to find our people in groups and forums and hashtags, and like that's where we migrate. And I know for me personally, that's what makes me feel like they're everywhere, is because I know where to go to find them now.
interesting. That's
Isn't that
really
interesting?
great. Yeah, good data.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, so tell me, about your work. What I love, it's like somatic journaling coach, right? Like so specific.
Mm.
And, of course, I know about somatic work, about getting into your body. We all know what journaling is. We know what a coach is, but I love
Mhm.
how you've pulled it together. So tell us a little bit about this and your background.
Okay, so for me, the somatic part really came from the fact that because of my high sensitivity and because I didn't really realize that I was highly sensitive until I had gone through enough trauma and manifested so much discomfort and, physical issues. And I was looking around at everyone in my world and I felt like, what is wrong with me that I'm not ever able to just be okay, that I'm always anxious, that my body is so reactive. What is going on? And it was a lot of years of research to stumble onto the term HSP and figure out what that actually means. And then to take that even further to realize that I was an INFJ, and all that personality stuff kind of explained why I'm so much more comfortable in my internal world. And as an HSP, quiet means everything to me. And I'd be curious to hear how you relate to this, but for me as an INFJ, my interior landscape is so much more vivid and so much louder than anything, in the walking world, that when I started looking for ways to heal that felt safe and easy, journaling just seemed like the most natural place to go. What's safer than your notebook? You don't have to explain yourself to anyone. You don't have to justify why you feel this way to anyone. And plus, I sort of came out of the womb writing myself personally. I've always been a writer. And so the to sort of answer your second question, and then I'll come back and tie it all together. I have always been a writer, and all through college, and even a master's program, I was studying literature. Like I got my bachelor's degree in English and I did an honors thesis in fiction writing. And then I was studying from my master's degree in creative writing, writing short stories and flirting with memoir and, trying to do it in a very, if you want to get published, it's not the Western world version, but like if you think about writing to heal is more holistic, and then writing to publish is a little bit more Western medicine-ish, you know what I mean? So after halfway through my master's program, I remember just feeling like people would always ask me, when are you going to publish this? when are you going to publish this? And I started noticing how for me, the reward was not the hope of getting published. The reward was spending time doing it. And my fiction has also always been like that quote that fiction is the lie that tells the truth truer. So it was always sort of an effort to get the truth that I couldn't talk to anyone about out of my body somehow. And then I went through a really dark period of awakening and seeing lots of things in my history as deeply traumatic. And it's kind of like the reckoning that woke me up to being sensitive, after which we're never the same. And I wrote a book about my deep trauma story just to free myself, just to get it out of me. And I was so stunned how healed I felt when I finished. I did it for NaNoWriMo, actually. Just kind of with a kamikaze, let's just write this out of me energy. And I felt so much lighter once I was done. It's like I could feel my nervous system smoothing out and being okay. It was amazing. And I get a little teared up when I talk about it. I don't know if you can tell, but that was kind of the moment where I thought, you know what, I need to figure out what I just did and bring this to other people who need it, because it's such a hard, the kind of pain that you can journal about is such a hard thing to qualify or be able to put into words and talk about, but somehow it can come out of your pen just beautifully and exactly as true as you mean it. And that's what I love about being able to offer this particular work. And I wrestled too with the idea of somatic writer or somatic journaler, because somatic writing has a little bit more of an intentionality to it. But somatic journaling is just kind of much more intuitive and free writing. It helps you connect to your body and just express whatever wants to come out. And it's almost always slightly, I like the term darker. I don't mean it in a negative way, but it's the darker emotions, right? It's usually the darker emotions and the more painful stories that we feel compelled to get out of us. And to have the freedom to do that in your truest voice in a journal page, I think is just extraordinary. It has been for me. And to be able to work with other women is just like the gift that keeps on giving.
You know what I think about as I hear you talking, it's like journaling, more process driven, right? Writing, more product driven, potentially.
Yeah, interesting. But yes, that's exactly what I mean. Very process driven. And in that beautiful way where the journey is the destination. And what I find really telling and a little trick that I use is that the harder it is to undertake the journey, the more you need it.
Mm-hmm.
From a healing perspective. And I know that you get that doing, in your work, but it's, so a lot of my work really with myself and then also with the women that I work with is about like holding their hand and saying it's okay and that you're in a dark place right now, but there is light like right on the other side of this tunnel that you're nervous to go into.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need that faith.
Mm-hmm.
It's a hard thing to undertake something like that with no idea if it's going to work. And because of my own experience, I feel really lucky to have the confidence to be like, it's okay. You can come this way. I know that it's going to make it better.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Are you familiar with the work of James Pennebaker?
No.
So he's a lot of like journaling therapy, sort of. Dr. James Pennebaker, he's out of University of Texas. But you might like his work, and it's very much like works with a lot of like trauma, cancer patients, even like, and does like pre and post studies of just like, how healing the writing process can be. So you might like to check him out.
I definitely will. Thank you for that recommendation.
Totally. Yeah. So let's talk HSP. All right. So
yes, please.
We're so special.
So special.
It's so funny. It's like I think the only HSP podcast I've done is with a therapist who focuses on HSPs and her work, April Snow. She's really lovely.
Oh,
And HSPs, I do find this with a lot of my clients. I'll be like, I think you might be. Go home and take the online quiz.
mhm.
And people will come back and be like, oh my gosh, I'm off the charts, or oh, I was like half and half. But I think when you're off the charts, and listeners, you can take a free online quiz. Just type in, HSP test or quiz, and it'll come right up. But,
Yeah.
it's like, it really does give a sense of, now I get it. I understand. So I'm curious about your journey into recognizing that you were an HSP.
Ooh, it was a rocky journey. Ooh. Um, yeah, I was, boy, this is what, oh my God, almost 15 years ago now, which is a shocking thing to say, but I was married about 6 years, like healthfully into the marriage and doing everything I could think of. And it was just depleting me. And it was emotionally exhausting. And my physical body was just in complete revolt. And I couldn't let go of things that everyone was telling me. You should just, what is the big deal? And I felt like a crazy person. How interesting that I'm tearing up again as I talk to you about it. But I found a therapist in the city that I was living, and she specialized in
Mm.
working with HSPs. Thank goodness, because I'd never heard the term. And I still remember my first couple appointments, that when you have all of the story and all of the misunderstanding, and it just feels like you're innervated from the inside. You have no calm. You have no idea what's going on. And I was in that state. It's kind of the right before you awaken state, I think. And she kept trying to direct our sessions and say, I think you might, just like you, I think you might be an HSP. And I can still remember my resistance. Like, you're not listening to me. This is my problem. I don't want to talk to you about a theory. This is my problem. And thank goodness she was like gentle and like, okay. But then she always brought me back to that. And I ignored it for probably 5 years. And then I got divorced. And I had a night, I think a couple months into my divorce, alone in the new apartment, totally hollow, late at night, looking through boxes. And I found this sheaf of paper she had given me talking about what an HSP is. And I think without all of that relationship noise and everything, I was just able to really take it in. And it was just like you described, the energy was like triple sevens. It was like, oh my gosh. And then everything made sense. And yeah. And nothing has been the same. Absolutely nothing.
And I realized, I was like, we didn't define what an HSP is. So some
Oh,
listeners may be like, what's that? Highly sensitive person. Everyone who doesn't speak that lingo, once you become or you recognize that you're an HSP, like you're just like, oh, HSP.
yeah.
But
Yeah,
yeah.
that's true. And the other thing that would be a really great ad here for people who are listening who think, maybe that's me, but I don't really know. Another thing that I really went through in my journey to owning highly sensitive person is how misunderstood I think that term is on the surface of things, not in the academic level when you start reading articles, but when you first hear it. I know for me, I got a lot of pushback if I tried to tell people I'm a highly sensitive person, because the immediate implication that it seemed like I got back was, are you saying I'm not sensitive? And that's really hard because you're trying to understand what is actually a nervous system condition. High sensitivity, we tend to be very emotional creatures, right? But it's not a choice we're making. We are born into the world with super highly attenuated, super porous nervous systems. So we notice we're taking in more stimuli. We notice more and we're affected more deeply by that stimuli. And that tends to make us more emotional because we feel everything more deeply. And so it becomes this vicious circle that until you realize what's going on is really hard to get out of. and even more difficult to explain to someone who doesn't know what that's like. Don't you
Right.
find like trying to explain high
Yes.
sensitivity to someone who hasn't had the experience is impossible?
Totally. And well, I think what is important is what you said is that, well, I'm sensitive. We're all sensitive, right? And it's like, no, no, not like this.
No, you think you are, but no.
Right. I mean, it comes down to listeners, and this is just fascinating to me, and it totally makes sense. But tags and clothing, it's just like how, it can
Oh,
really bother. And like lights and, just overwhelm of just stimuli. It's,
ticking ceiling fans and
oh
oh,
no.
God, forget about it. I'd rather die than I can't sleep in a room with a.
No. Yeah.
I
Or like,
actually,
go
no,
ahead.
sorry, go ahead.
You go ahead.
I had a reputation when I was younger because I was young and I didn't know how to use scissors, maybe, but like I would cut the tags out of every single thing that I owned badly. So there would always be holes right back here. Drove my poor mother crazy, but I couldn't help it because I just couldn't handle the tags.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
And
it's so interesting.
yeah, it really is. And so, like I feel this kind of charge being able to talk with you about this so validating, don't you think? And hopefully people listening will be able to share in that energy of like, you are really not too sensitive. You just are sensitive. There's a difference.
Exactly. And right, there's a great book, right? Highly Sensitive Person. And then I haven't read this one, but Highly Sensitive Person in Love.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, by Elaine Aron.
Yes.
A highly sensitive person in love was interesting. Um, because I think that could have been a much bigger book. I mean,
Mm.
it's a good sort of starting off point, but one of the things that has certainly been true in my journey, but that actually is true for a lot of highly sensitive people's journeys is that you get into the relationship long before you realize that you're different and how you're different and what that means and what trauma you might be carrying. And so then from that space to adapt your relationship to, okay, now I'm an HSP and this is what I need can be really rocky
Mm.
because your partner is not necessarily like open to that. And then we get into some dangerous waters, right? Because HSPs have a real innate tendency to, um, what would be the polite way to say this? Like over accommodate people,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
forgive when people aren't really giving us the effort that we deserve, and
Mm-hmm.
hang around in the hope that maybe if we just keep explaining long enough. And that can easily reveal itself to be a kind of unbalanced or toxic relationship. And then because you are trying to kind of own the truth of who you are, which is highly sensitive, a lot of times the relationships around you tend to fall apart. If you're already in that space, and that's just another really confusing, difficult trauma that you have to manage at the same time. And I don't think we can have enough support for highly sensitive people going through that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Well, it's so funny as you were talking, I was just thinking, man, I'll bet relationships are harder for HSPs. I mean, their relationships are hard, period, right?
Right.
But then you add in this additional layer. Yeah, not easy.
I really think that's true. I think that if you know that you're an HSP, you know what that means. You've sort of had you're in a place more like you and I are talking about it, where we get it and we're comfortable with it and we know what we need much better. Then starting a relationship is different because you're on a different level. But when you don't know and you get into one and you're trying to maintain it, and maybe you're awakening, that is just, at least for me, just the hardest thing I've ever had to do. And it didn't even work,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Yeah.
And that happens a lot. And also I think that I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, but I think that highly sensitive people are some of the bravest, strongest people
Mm-hmm.
out there because we feel so much all the time with no breaks. And we very commonly struggle with physical pain or illness that either has a diagnosis or doesn't have a diagnosis. And we walk through the world like that all the time. That takes an uncommon amount of strength. And it's ironic because of how often we feel broken,
Totally.
like open bleeding wounds, but actually
Right.
are incredibly strong. Um and then to undertake any kind of healing journey around embracing your sensitivity and managing these relationships is just a whole other level. It's so laudable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think
Yeah.
that's a really interesting thing. I never really thought of as, HSPs as, oh, we're more brave, but no, you're right. It's not easy to be such a feeler.
It's really not.
When you talk about, which, leads me into my next question that I really like, is the importance of kind of like healing and tapping into and touching, your sensitive story of sorts. And how do you, like, for our listeners, I'm curious, how would you recommend that people kind of go there or get in touch with that?
Ooh, that's such a big question. I love it. But it's also like a diving board question. Because so in my experience, personal experience and professional experience working with other sensitive women, we don't necessarily seek out healing unless something has hurt us, right? That makes sense. So it's the acknowledgement of the pain, whatever kind of pain it is. I call myself a shadow worker. I love shadow work. And my definition of shadow work is really just the acknowledgement and willingness to spend time in those more shadowy emotions like resentment or fear or rage or any spectrum on the anger scale. I'm very into. And anxiety and depression and sadness and shame. And because those are the things common for us to absorb before we start seeking out healing. So once we get to the healing place, we've got like years and decades maybe of stories about us where we should be embarrassed for being how we are. And we were trying to fit in, and that led to maybe a toxic relationship or a traumatizing experience. And our bodies hold all of that. So and I would assume, I don't know, obviously, but I would assume that as a therapist, with the people that you work with, you hear a version of a certain story over and over, right? Yeah. So for me, because I work primarily with empaths and highly sensitive women, there is a version of the story where when we're young, we're doing all the things, we're cutting the tags, we can't wear jeans, we're picking up on people's energy and things that they don't recognize about themselves. And we try to talk to them and they're like, what are you doing? So we grow up feeling like maybe we're weird. We trust ourselves less. And the teen years, I think, are really dangerous. They're like real dangerous waters for us because we tend to try to suppress our innate feelings and sell ourselves out more to fit in, which inevitably lands us into relationships where we feel taken for granted or more overtly damaged. And then we probably get sick because our nervous systems are so fried and our bodies are so stressed. And then we hit rock bottom and then we start looking for healers and then we pick up like where we are now. Some version of that is pretty common in my experience. So healing your sensitive story is really, I think, starting with, do you resonate with any of that? And the somatic part is also like, when I say, do you resonate, I kind of mean, do you feel that in your body anywhere? Like when you hear me say shame, where does that billow? And if you can feel something like in your abdomen or, the back of your neck, then that's a sign that there is energy connected to a story in your body that needs to be integrated so that it can be released so that you're not being driven by that, by all the stuff that you're holding anymore. Which is maybe a long-winded way to answer your question. I'm not sure. How'd I do?
You did great. Yeah, because it's not like, well, here's the 3-step process. Do you know what I mean? It's not like
Yes.
that.
And I'm so
Since
glad you said that, honestly, because especially as an INFJ HSP, I can't stand a 3-step process. It's so completely dismissive of all the gray areas in between those steps. It makes me crazy.
and yet we love them as like a society, right? It's like
Yes.
we love the not quick fixes, but it's like articles that are like 5 steps to X. It's just like it's something that we're drawn to. But yet, as you say, there's so many levels in between, and we're all so different. Yeah.
And we're all so different. And I I think it's the writer in me, and I think it's the INFJ in me. I like to meet people at the at the kind of true bloody depth of where they're really at, where they really need help and healing. I can't stand it when people dance around when I need help. And so I don't like to do that with other people. And it's probably a good thing because I think it keeps the people who are like, whoa, let's settle down just a little. And they can let their nervous systems get used to the idea that going deep is the thing that's going to make you feel the most validated, honestly, because you can try to positive affirmation your way into feeling better. But if you're doing that and you don't feel like it's working, the reason is probably because you're so full of things that you need to let go of so that you can make room for that beauty to come in. Certainly that's my feeling and my approach.
Well, I'm curious, how do you help people figure out where they need to go, like into the shadow side, right? Into the darker side. And you mentioned saying like shame, noticing where it shows up in your body. And of course, listeners, that's the somatic experience. And it's so important, right? Because we try to figure so much out in our head, which is
Yeah.
lovely. It keeps us a productive member of society, but it also leads us very astray. Versus, checking in and being like, okay, so picture yourself doing X. How does that feel in your body? Picture yourself doing Y. How does that feel in your body? And it's just so interesting how we can really learn to trust and pay attention to our body, but it is not easy. We are not taught this in school, right? Unless you had acting. I feel like people who had acting classes kind of.
Well, yeah, probably. But generally speaking, no, we're not taught that. In fact, I think we're discouraged from this.
Yes.
Because everything should happen fast. Like, what are you waiting for? Let's go, let's go, let's go. And it's like, you can't take 5 minutes and tune in if you have the world around you being like, you're late.
Hurry up. Yeah.
Um, okay. So the question was, how do I begin to,
Yeah, totally. How do you help people figure out where they need to go into the shadow part of themselves or the darker side? You mentioned shame, noticing how that shows up in your body. Is there something around shame that, we want to work on?
Yeah. Yeah. So in my private work, I would just kind of generally start by asking someone like, what's going on? And the more they talk, the more I can sort of hear if they sound panicked or they sound, or they sound really locked away from this, which is almost always an indicator of either fear or shame, right? And I like to use conversation to sort of give people the space to vocalize how they're doing in the present moment. Because I think, and I'm also really curious about how you receive this, but I think that INFJs, because we're on the far side of the sensitivity spectrum, the extreme side, we represent 1.5% of the global population, right? Which is insane. And we are typified by being we have the highest emotional intelligence, not to denigrate anyone else who has high emotional intelligence, because obviously there's a lot of people. But that's a really common trait for us to have. So not only are we picking up on everything from people, but we have a lot to process around it. But because of our high level of emotional intelligence, it can be very difficult for us to find people who can just hold space to have a conversation with us without asking us to explain ourselves and, justify why we're saying that, that kind of thing. So the first gift of working with me privately is that you get the opportunity to talk about what you're noticing, what you think, how you feel with someone who gets it. You don't need to explain anything to me. I can just receive it. It's not a problem. Your emotion doesn't scare me. Your opinion doesn't scare. It's all okay. And that gives people a chance to sort of hear themselves talk. And that gives them a sort of, it sort of intrinsically shows them what their problem is. Whatever they find themselves talking about, this is the first pain point. And my work is really about levels. So like we find the first pain point, which is the one that's the most surface, the easiest one to access. And then I would ask questions like, okay, so are you thinking about anybody in particular? Or like, is there a certain memory popping up when you say this to me? And there almost always will be. Like, yeah, actually, this reminds me of, my dad when I was 9 and I was sitting at the kitchen, and there's like a memory attached to that feeling. And then I'll invite them to talk about that. And that takes us a little bit deeper. And then at a certain point, we're deep enough where it's valuable to do a journaling prompt. And the journaling prompt sort of helps them work out the deep emotion that's in that place that they probably didn't get a chance to express at the time. And then one of my favorite parts about my process is that after they journal, just for little microbursts of time, like 2 minutes, just enough to get in there and figure out, like release the steam valve. Then I invite them to read what they've written out loud, which is such a liberating, because writing sort of magnetizes stuff up out of your body, down your arm, out your pen onto the page, right? But then speaking it is like a whole other level of ownership. And it's liberating, and it sets them free, and it makes them feel strong, and it makes them feel like they can do that because I'm a safe space. I'm not going to question you or whatever. And then from there, we'll talk about, well, how was that? And we might talk about, what? It's funny because now that I'm thinking about that, I'm feeling like this. And then we'll repeat the process and go a little bit deeper and deeper. And it's just a very like gentle unraveling, filled with validation. And inevitably you can look back, depending on how long you work with me, and see how much you've unraveled, and how what seemed painful 3 weeks ago, you remember it, but it doesn't phase you anymore because the charged energy around that is gone.
I love that. I picture like an onion, right? And you're peeling apart the layers. Yeah. I love that.
I use the metaphor of like a giant tangled ball of yarn. Like if you're holding it right behind your rib cage and it's just hopeless. Like, how do you even begin to quote, heal your sensitive story? It's such a massive,
right. Yeah.
Ridiculous. And probably sends people into despair just thinking about it. But doing it this way is more like we find the edge of that tangled up ball, and we just like gently pull it, and then gently pull again and pull again until you're left with like just a pile of loose yarn, and everything feels okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. I love it.
Thanks. It's so gorgeous.
Well, let me ask you this, Jennifer. So, before I ask my final question, is there anything else that you would like to share with our listeners about somatic journaling as a whole, or any particular prompt maybe that you would like to share?
I think the thing that I would like to share the most about somatic journaling, and please let me know if this doesn't accurately answer your question, but it conjures up the idea of fear for a lot of people. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And the way that I got into it, the way that I realized that it was valuable, was through writing my own pain out of my body. And it's a brave choice. if it's going to be therapeutic, it's a brave choice, because you're basically saying, I'm willing to sort of gingerly step into my body and feel some things that I am nervous about. So if you feel nervous at the idea of doing that, that's both okay and a sign that something in you is really, really ready for that. Mm. Like something is right below the surface simmering, and nothing worthwhile ever feels safe right before you start. Right? I mean, maybe some worthwhile things are. That might be a little bit of an overstatement, but any healing work, like emotional healing work, always feels most dangerous right before you begin. Mm-hmm. And with somatic journaling, if you're holding a lot that makes the idea of talking about any of it feel dangerous, that's okay. That's normal. And that's a really good indicator that something in your body could really use this work. And that from my own experience, 10,000%, and everything I have ever seen with any client I've ever worked with, the reward and the lightness and the empowerment and the inner peace on the other side of it it's pretty much a guarantee. And it's so worth your bravery. It's such a reward. And so because I have if you can release your shadow emotions and start to release the steam valve in your body of all the things that you're holding that you're a little nervous to express. I think if I were going to give a prompt, it would be something like, you could even start by just writing out a list, write for 2 minutes and write out a list. And the prompt would be, these are all the reasons I'm scared to write about my body. Mm-hmm. And just set a timer on your phone, write for 2 minutes and see if anything comes up. The whole trick is to keep your pen moving, because we're trying to get out of our heads, as you said. And if you can put your pen to the page with the prompt and just write and keep your pen going forward for 2 minutes, even if what you're writing is like top layer, have to get it out of the way, stuff like, I hate this prompt, I don't feel this way at all, this is so dumb, what am I going to have for dinner? If that's what you write, then keep writing that, because eventually it will give way to something else. You're just getting the noise out of the way. And you will either find you don't have a single problem being in your body at all, or you'll see the places where there's a wound there, or there's some energy there that could use some tending to and some love. And so then you know that somatic journaling is something that could be revealing and helpful for you.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, I love the blend, somatic and journaling. So it's so smart. And my last question for you, Jennifer, is the name of the podcast is Tranquility du Jour. And so I'm curious, how do you find tranquility in every day? I'm assuming some journaling is happening.
Yes, I do find tranquility with journaling. But my greatest source of tranquility is beauty. Honestly, which is one of the reasons why I love everything that you put out so very much, is because aesthetics are, I'm sure this isn't an accident either, now that I know that you feel that you are an HSP, but if you live with a super sensitive nervous system and you are picking up deeply everything that's in your environment, the more beauty we can surround ourselves with, the more nourished we can feel just minute to minute every day. So my go-tos are candles, flowers, fresh flowers, pictures of flowers, any kind of flower, anything. Personally, and I know you feel this way too, anything French. Mm-hmm. I'm such a Francophile. I love the refinement and the elegance and the, soft lighting, natural light, music. Music is such a good nervous system soother. Even if it's like not necessarily soothing music, anything that makes you feel like your true self is good to embrace as often as you can. Mm-hmm. And I have to say, I have been embracing the whole capsule wardrobe concept because of you and your beautiful capsule line. When I first came across that, I thought, oh my gosh, that's such a revelation. The idea that you can spare yourself having to make decisions every day about clothes and just wear black is one of my favorite things. I couldn't wait to get dressed in my black dress to come on your podcast today.
I love it.
So yeah, those are like my go-to everyday, as much as I can, tricks. They make me feel calm and they make life feel more sacred.
I love.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead. When you were saying it, which is important, and
Yeah.
what I love about this too is, have you ever taken the VIA Strengths kind of like online? It's like a quiz. It's popular in positive psychology, but it's a free thing. So you could take it. And I don't know how many strengths there are, but maybe like 50. I'll just say 50. And my biggest strength, my number one thing, is appreciation of beauty. I'm like, other people have patience and, wonderful things like that. And I'm like, I appreciate beauty. So it's just kind of funny. When you said that, I was like, yeah, I get it.
I'll bet you anything that would be how I test too.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll send you the link to that quiz.
I would love that. Yeah. I've learned so much. I have so many good resources to check out. Thanks to you.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. It's really a treat. I love the work that you're doing. I love what you put out into the world. I love following you on Instagram. And so thank you for being here with us today.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And likewise to everything that you're putting out, your newsletters and your Instagram. And it's been an honor and a real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.